The steam rose from the communal showers like morning fog over troubled waters, creating a haze that seemed to muffle both sound and conscience. Lieutenant Sarah Ghost Martinez stood under the scalding spray, letting the hot water wash away another 18-hour training day that had pushed every recruit to their absolute limits. At 5'4" and barely 130 pounds soaking wet, she had learned long ago that in military environments, being underestimated was often her greatest advantage. The Naval Special Warfare Training Facility at Coronado was notorious for breaking spirits before it ever touched bodies. Here, in this concrete temple of human endurance, dreams came to die under the relentless California sun. The shower facility, with its institutional white tiles and stark fluorescent lighting, was one of the few places where the constant pressure momentarily lifted. But tonight, that sanctuary was about to be violated. Sarah heard their voices before she saw them. 3 male voices echoing off the tiled walls with a particular brand of arrogance that came from those who had never truly been tested. Her enhanced hearing, honed through years of covert operations in hostile territories, picked up their conversation long before they rounded the corner into the women's section of the showers. "I'm telling you, Martinez is getting special treatment," came the voice of Cadet Thompson, a linebacker-sized recruit from Texas whose daddy's political connections had smoothed his path to Coronado. "There's no way someone that small should be passing the same tests we are." "Maybe she's got something on the instructors," suggested Cadet Wilson, his New Jersey accent thick with insinuation. "You know how these diversity hires work their way up the chain." The third voice belonged to Cadet Rodriguez, and Sarah noted the particular venom in his tone, the anger of someone who felt his own heritage had been somehow diminished by her presence. "She's making us all look bad. Command thinks if a little girl can do it, we should be doing better." Sarah's jaw tightened as she continued washing, her movements deliberate and controlled. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times throughout her military career. The assumption that her success was somehow unearned, that her 5 Purple Hearts and 3 Silver Stars were participation trophies rather than recognition of genuine heroism. What they didn't know, what nobody at this training facility knew, was that Lieutenant Sarah Martinez wasn't really a cadet at all. She was Commander Sarah Martinez, one of the most decorated SEAL operators in naval special warfare history, temporarily assigned to evaluate training protocols after several high-profile mission failures had raised questions about the quality of graduating classes. Her cover was so deep that even the facility commander believed she was just another candidate working her way through the program. The footsteps grew closer, and Sarah made a calculated decision. Rather than announce her presence or attempt to leave, she continued her shower routine, watching the entrance through her peripheral vision. Experience had taught her that sometimes the best intelligence came from allowing situations to develop naturally. "There she is," Thompson's voice carried clearly through the steam. Perfect timing. The 3 cadets entered the shower area with the predatory confidence of wolves who had found isolated prey. Thompson, at 6'3" and 220 pounds, led the group. Wilson, slightly smaller but more wiry, flanked left. Rodriguez, built like a middleweight boxer, moved to block the exit. Sarah assessed the tactical situation in milliseconds. 3 opponents, superior size and reach advantage, enclosed space with limited escape routes, wet surfaces affecting footing. In her mental catalog of combat scenarios, this ranked somewhere between Tuesday morning and mild inconvenience. "Well," Thompson called out, his voice echoing off the tiles. "Look who we found all by herself." Sarah turned slowly, making sure her expression conveyed exactly the right amount of concern. Not enough to seem genuinely frightened, but sufficient to maintain her cover as an ordinary cadet. "Gentlemen, I believe you're in the wrong facility. The men's showers are across the hall." "See, that's where you're wrong, Martinez." Wilson stepped closer, water from the overhead sprays beginning to dampen his PT gear. "We're exactly where we need to be." "You've been making waves," Rodriguez added, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Acting like you're something special, making the rest of us look bad." Sarah shifted her weight slightly, positioning herself for maximum mobility despite the slippery floor. Her cover identity required her to appear vulnerable, but Every instinct screamed for immediate action. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to graduate like everyone else. Bullshit, Thompson spat, moving within arm's reach. You think because you're a woman, because you're Hispanic, you get special rules? Special treatment. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. If they only knew that she had personally eliminated more enemy combatants than the three of them combined would ever see in their entire military careers. That she had infiltrated terrorist cells in Syria, conducted solo reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines in Afghanistan, and received commendations from 4 different NATO commanders. I earn everything I get, she replied quietly, her voice carrying just enough edge to suggest hidden depths. Sure you do, Wilson laughed harshly. With what? Your pretty face? Your sob story about growing up poor in East L.A. Sarah's background was indeed from East L.A., though the poverty part was fabricated cover. Her real childhood had been spent in a military family, traveling from base to base, absorbing different cultures and languages that would later prove invaluable in special operations. But the struggle was real, just not the kind these men could comprehend. Look, she said, reaching for a towel, I don't want any trouble. Too late for that. Thompson grabbed her wrist, his grip intended to intimidate. See, we've decided that maybe it's time someone taught you your place in the food chain. The touch triggered something primal in Sarah's training. Physical contact meant the situation had escalated beyond verbal intimidation. Protocol demanded assessment of hostile intent, evaluation of immediate threats, and appropriate response to neutralize the danger. But her cover also demanded she maintain the appearance of vulnerability for as long as tactically feasible. Please, she said, allowing a slight tremor to enter her voice. Just let me get dressed and leave. Oh, you'll leave all right. Rodriguez moved closer from behind. But first, we're going to make sure you understand exactly what happens to people who don't know their place. Wilson reached into his pocket and produced his smartphone. This is going to be educational for everyone. Sarah's mind rapidly calculated possibilities. 3 men, one with a recording device, clear intent to commit assault, isolated location. The feminist in her was outraged. The soldier in her was coldly analytical. The SEAL commander in her was already planning their complete tactical destruction. Guys, seriously, she tried one more time. You don't want to do this. Actually, Thompson's grip tightened painfully. I think we really do. Water continued to cascade around them, creating a rhythmic soundtrack to what was about to become a very educational experience, though not quite the lesson any of them were expecting. Sarah's training had prepared her for every conceivable combat scenario. She had fought in the mountains of Afghanistan, the jungles of Southeast Asia, and the urban sprawl of war-torn cities across 3 continents. But this moment in a shower facility in California would require perhaps the most delicate balance of her entire career. She needed to neutralize 3 hostiles while maintaining her cover identity, protect herself without revealing the extent of her capabilities, and ensure that justice was served without compromising an ongoing classified operation. Thompson's grip loosened slightly as he gestured to his accomplices, and in that microsecond of tactical opportunity, Sarah made her decision. The time for pretending to be helpless had officially ended. You know what, boys? She said, her voice suddenly carrying a different quality entirely. Calm, professional, and absolutely devoid of fear. I think it's time we had a more honest conversation about exactly who you're dealing with. The steam continued to rise around them, but the atmosphere in the shower facility had shifted dramatically. 3 predators had cornered what they believed was prey, only to discover they had wandered into the territory of something far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. The real education was about to begin, and the lesson plan would be written in ways they would never forget. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the person you underestimate most is exactly the person who will change your understanding of everything you thought you knew about power, respect, and consequences. In the next few moments, 3 cadets would learn that assumptions are dangerous things, and that in the world of special operations, the most lethal weapons often come in the smallest packages. They would discover that real strength has nothing to do with size, and that true authority doesn't need to announce itself. It simply is. Sarah's transformation from a parent victim to something else entirely would shatter their worldview and reshape their understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. But first, they had to survive the lesson. The change in Sarah's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable, like the moment before a storm when the air pressure shifts and every instinct warns of approaching danger. Thompson, still gripping her wrist, felt the transformation before he understood it. The sudden stillness in her posture, the way her breathing became controlled and purposeful. "Last chance, gentlemen," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made hardened veterans snap to attention. "Walk away now, and we'll pretend this never happened." Wilson laughed nervously, glancing at his phone camera. "Did you hear that? She's threatening us now." "Not threatening," Sarah corrected, her dark eyes fixing on each of them in turn. "Warning." Rodriguez stepped closer from behind, reaching out to grab her shoulder. "You need to learn some respect, little girl." What happened next would be replayed in slow motion in Rodriguez's memory for years to come. Sarah's left hand moved in a precise arc, intercepting his reaching arm and applying pressure to a nerve cluster that sent lightning through his entire nervous system. Her right hand, still held by Thompson, twisted in a movement that looked impossible but felt very real as his grip was broken and his wrist hyperextended to the edge of injury. In the same fluid motion, she stepped to the side, causing Wilson to stumble forward as his intended grab met only empty air. He crashed into the wet tile wall with a satisfying thud that echoed through the shower facility. "Jesus Christ," Thompson gasped, cradling his wrist and staring at Sarah with new eyes. "What the hell was that?" "Basic hand-to-hand combat," Sarah replied matter-of-factly, adjusting her towel with the casual confidence of someone completely comfortable with violence. "Level 1. Would you like to see Level 2? Rodriguez was shaking his arm, trying to restore feeling to his fingers. "You're some kind of martial arts freak." "Something like that," Sarah agreed, though her smile suggested the reality was far more complex. "Now, I believe I suggested you gentlemen leave." But Thompson's pride had been wounded along with his wrist, and wounded pride often led to poor tactical decisions. 3 against 1, he snarled. "I don't care what kind of karate you know." Technically, it was Krav Maga mixed with some Filipino martial arts, Sarah corrected helpfully. "And you're right about the numbers. 3 against 1 is hardly fair." For a moment, hope flickered in Wilson's eyes as he struggled to his feet. Then, Sarah continued, "For you 3, the attack came coordinated and desperate. Thompson rushed from the front, Wilson flanked right, and Rodriguez, still nursing his tingling arm, moved left. It was actually a reasonably sound tactical approach against an ordinary opponent. Sarah Martinez was anything but ordinary. She dropped low as Thompson charged, his momentum carrying him over her as she swept his legs. He crashed into the shower wall with enough force to crack tiles. Wilson's flanking maneuver met Sarah's elbow at approximately stomach level, doubling him over and sending him sliding across the wet floor. Rodriguez, perhaps learning from his teammates' mistakes, approached more cautiously. This gave Sarah time to properly assess him as an opponent. Good footwork, trained stance, probably some amateur boxing experience. Under normal circumstances, he might have posed an actual challenge. These are not normal circumstances. Sarah waited for his jab, deflected it with minimal effort, and responded with a precise strike to his solar plexus that dropped him to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 15 seconds. "Now," Sarah said conversationally, stepping over Wilson's prone form to retrieve her toiletry bag, "would anyone like to explain to me what you thought you were going to accomplish here?" Thompson, blood trickling from his nose where he'd met the wall, stared at her in shock. "Who are you?" "That's an interesting question," Sarah mused, pulling out her phone and checking the time. "And one that I think deserves a proper answer." She began getting dressed with unhurried precision, completely ignoring the 3 men scattered around the shower floor like discarded laundry. Her movements were economical and purposeful, speaking of someone accustomed to changing clothes quickly in hostile environments. "You see, boys, you made several critical errors tonight," she continued, pulling on her PT shirt. First, you assumed that physical size correlates directly with combat capability. Second, you assumed that my gender made me vulnerable rather than underestimated. And third, and this is the big one, you assumed you knew who you were dealing with. Rodriguez had finally caught his breath enough to speak. You're just another cadet. We've seen your file. Have you? Sarah's smile was genuinely amused. That's fascinating. Tell me, what exactly did my file say? Born in East LA, joined the Navy straight out of high school. Decent test scores, but nothing special. Wilson wheezed from his position against the wall. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's a very interesting story. Completely fictional, but interesting nonetheless. She pulled out her wallet and extracted what appeared to be a standard military ID. But as she held it up for them to see, the blood drained from Thompson's face. Commander Sarah Martinez, she read aloud. Naval Special Warfare Command. Clearance level, above your pay grade. The silence that followed was profound. Even the sound of running water seemed muted by the weight of revelation. That's impossible, Rodriguez whispered. You're a cadet. We've been training with you for weeks. You've been training, Sarah corrected. I've been evaluating. There's a difference. She finished dressing and picked up her gear bag, slinging it over her shoulder with practiced ease. You see, there have been some concerns at the Pentagon about the quality of recent SEAL graduating classes. Mission failure rates have increased, unit cohesion has decreased, and there have been several incidents involving harassment and assault. Thompson tried to push himself to his feet, but thought better of it when Sarah's gaze fixed on him. So, she continued, I was assigned to go undercover, work my way through the training program, and assess where the problems might be originating. Tonight, gentlemen, has been very illuminating. Wilson's phone, which had been recording throughout the encounter, lay forgotten on the wet floor. Sarah picked it up, examined the footage, and nodded approvingly. Excellent quality, she commented. This will make an excellent exhibit for the inquiry board. Wait, Thompson's voice cracked with desperation. You can't. This will ruin our careers before they start. Should have thought of that before you decided to assault a fellow service member, Sarah replied without sympathy. Actions have consequences. I would have thought that was covered in basic training. Rodriguez struggled to his feet, pride warring with pragmatism. Look, Commander, we didn't know what? Sarah's voice cut like a blade. Didn't know that sexual assault is a crime? Didn't know that threatening and intimidating fellow service members is against the Uniform Code of Military Justice? Or didn't know that I specifically could break all three of you without working up a sweat? She paused, studying their faces with the analytical precision of someone accustomed to reading enemies and allies alike. Because honestly, only one of those things should have mattered. The rest should have been enough to stop you from ever considering this course of action. Wilson tried a different approach. Commander, please. We made a mistake. We were angry about the training, about the pressure, and we took it out on the wrong person. But we didn't really hurt you. Hurt me? Sarah's laugh was genuinely amused. Son, I've been shot, stabbed, blown up, and tortured by some of the most creative minds in international terrorism. You three couldn't hurt me if I spotted you baseball bats and a head start. She moved toward the exit, then paused and turned back. But that's not the point, is it? The point is that you thought you could hurt someone you perceived as weaker, someone you thought couldn't fight back. You saw what you believed was vulnerability and decided to exploit it. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Thompson finally managed to stand, leaning heavily against the wall. What happens now? Now, Sarah checked her watch again. Now you have exactly 10 minutes to report to the facility commander's office and explain tonight's events. I'll be along shortly to provide my own account. And if we don't? Rodriguez asked, though they all knew the answer. Sarah held up Wilson's phone. Then, this video, along with my full report, goes directly to the Pentagon. Sexual assault in the military is a federal crime, gentlemen. The Navy takes it very seriously, especially when it involves someone attempting to assault a commanding officer. The weight of their situation was finally settling in. 3 promising military careers balanced on the edge of complete destruction, all because they had mistaken courage for weakness and discipline for special treatment. Commander, Thompson tried one final time. Isn't there some way we can work this out? Some alternative to destroying our futures. Sarah studied him for a long moment, and for just an instant, they saw something almost like compassion in her dark eyes. Your futures aren't destroyed, Cadet Thompson. Changed, certainly, but men have come back from worse mistakes than this. The question is whether you're going to learn from tonight or spend the rest of your lives making excuses for it. She moved toward the door, then stopped one final time. Oh, and gentlemen, when you tell your story to the commander, I suggest you be completely honest. I have a very good memory for details, and my version of events will be extremely thorough. As she reached the exit, Rodriguez called out desperately, "Commander, who are you really? What's your actual story?" Sarah turned back, and for the first time that evening, her smile held genuine warmth. Maybe someday, if you manage to actually become SEALs instead of just playing dress-up, you'll earn the right to hear it. Until then, remember this. The most dangerous person in any room is usually the one you never see coming. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving 3 broken cadets alone with the sound of running water and the weight of choices that would change their lives forever. Outside, Sarah walked calmly through the corridors of the training facility, her mind already composing the report that would determine these young men's futures. She had seen enough combat to know the difference between enemies and fools, and tonight she had encountered the latter. The question now was whether they were fools worth saving. Captain James Walsh had commanded the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility at Coronado for 3 years, and in that time he thought he had seen everything the human condition could offer. Former SEALs attempting to relive glory days, privileged college boys who thought military service was a summer camp, and everything in between. But the sight of 3 of his cadets standing at attention in his office at 2,200 hours, soaking wet, and clearly in various states of physical distress, was something new. Would someone like to explain why you're dripping on my carpet at this hour? Walsh's voice carried the particular weariness of a commander who knew his evening was about to get much worse. Thompson stepped forward slightly, his split lip making speech difficult. "Sir, we need to report an incident involving Cadet Martinez." Walsh leaned back in his chair, noting the careful way Rodriguez held his left arm and Wilson's obvious difficulty breathing normally. "What kind of incident?" "Sir," Wilson began, then stopped, glancing at his companions. The truth felt impossible to articulate. "How did you explain to your commanding officer that you had attempted to assault someone who turned out to be a superior officer in disguise?" "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Thompson asked, knowing that whatever protection military courtesy might provide was about to evaporate. "Granted, and make it fast. I have real problems to deal with." "Sir, we confronted Cadet Martinez in the shower facility tonight. We intended to intimidate her, sir, to teach her what we thought was her place." Walsh's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Continue." Rodriguez took over, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, she defended herself. Easily. Then, she identified herself as Commander Martinez from Naval Special Warfare Command." The silence that followed was profound. Walsh stared at the 3 cadets for nearly 30 seconds before speaking. "Are you telling me that you attempted to assault an officer?" "Sir, we didn't know," Wilson began. "I don't care what you didn't know." Walsh's voice cut through the excuse like a bayonet. "You attempted to assault what you believed was a fellow cadet. The rank is irrelevant to the fundamental crime." A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. "Enter," Walsh called. Sarah Martinez walked into the office, now dressed in proper uniform with rank insignia clearly visible. The transformation was startling. Gone was any pretense of vulnerability, replaced by the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority in the world's most dangerous places. "Commander Martinez." Walsh rose from his chair, genuine confusion evident. "I was told you were a cadet in the current training cycle." "I was, sir. Under deep cover, evaluating training protocols and unit culture." Sarah handed him a sealed envelope. "My orders and clearance documentation." Walsh opened the envelope and read quickly, his expression growing grimmer with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Sarah with something approaching respect. "Commander, I had no idea. Your cover was comprehensive." "Thank you, sir. It was meant to be." Sarah's gaze swept over the three cadets. These men have just provided me with valuable data about systemic problems in the training culture. Thompson found his voice. Sir, Commander Martinez said we had 10 minutes to report. We came as quickly as we could. How generous of her. Walsh replied dryly. Commander, your assessment? Sarah moved to the center of the office, her posture shifting into something that spoke of briefing rooms and classified operations. Sir, what happened tonight represents a pattern I've observed throughout my time in the program. These three cadets believed they had identified weakness and decided to exploit it for personal gratification. She began pacing slowly, her voice taking on the cadence of an after-action report. They cornered what they believed was an isolated female cadet, physically restrained her, and made explicit threats of sexual assault while recording the encounter for later distribution. Their stated motivation was anger at perceived special treatment and a desire to, quote, teach her place in the food chain. Walsh's jaw tightened. And how did you respond, Commander? I attempted de-escalation first, offering them multiple opportunities to disengage. When they escalated to physical contact and explicit threats, I defended myself using appropriate force. Define appropriate. No permanent injuries, sir. Some bruising, minor lacerations, temporary incapacitation. I could have done much worse. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, remembering exactly how easily she had controlled the situation. Sir, she's telling the truth. We never had a chance. That's not the point, Sarah interjected sharply. The point is that you thought you were attacking someone who couldn't defend herself. The fact that you were wrong doesn't diminish the intent. Walsh nodded slowly. Commander, what's your recommendation? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the three men who had unknowingly ended their military careers in a shower facility. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many good people die while worthless ones lived. Sir, these men demonstrated fundamental character flaws that make them unsuitable for special operations. They showed poor judgment, predatory behavior, and a complete lack of the values that define naval special warfare. Thompson felt his world collapsing. Commander, please. We made a mistake. A terrible mistake, but we can learn from it. We can be better. Can you? Sarah's gaze was unflinching. Because in 6 months, when you're deployed in a hostile environment, what happens when you encounter real weakness? Real vulnerability? What happens when you're responsible for protecting civilian populations or working with female personnel from allied nations? Wilson tried to stand straighter despite his aching ribs. You would never what? Exploit perceived weakness for personal gratification? You literally just did exactly that. Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. You saw someone you thought was vulnerable and decided she needed to learn her place through intimidation and assault. Rodriguez found the courage to meet her eyes. Ma'am, we were wrong. Completely wrong. But doesn't everyone deserve a second chance? Sarah studied him for a moment, then turned to Walsh. Sir, with your permission, I'd like to share something with these cadets. Walsh nodded, settling back in his chair to watch a masterclass in leadership. Gentlemen, Sarah began, let me tell you about my first deployment to Afghanistan. I was 22 years old, barely out of training myself, assigned to a joint special operations team. Our mission was to extract a CIA asset from Taliban territory. The room had grown completely still. Our asset was a woman named Fatima. She had been feeding intelligence to coalition forces for 2 years, saving countless American lives. When her cover was blown, we had 12 hours to get her out before she was executed. Sarah's voice took on the distant quality of someone reliving painful memories. The extraction went wrong. We were surrounded, outnumbered, running low on ammunition. And in that moment, when death seemed certain, do you know what Fatima did? The cadets remained silent, transfixed. She grabbed an AK-47 from a dead Taliban fighter and fought beside us. This woman, who had risked everything to help Americans, probably saved my life that night. She was 5 feet tall, maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, and she was the bravest person I had ever seen. Sarah paused, letting the story sink in. We got her out. Barely. But during the firefight, I learned something that has guided every day of my career since then. Courage has nothing to do with size, gender, or how intimidating you look in uniform. It comes from character, from choosing to do right even when it costs you everything. Thompson's voice was barely audible. What happened to her? She's now a doctor in California, married to one of the Marines who was on that extraction team. They have 3 children. Sarah's smile was genuine, but sad. She represents the best of what we fight for. The idea that strength protects weakness, that power serves justice, that warriors exist to defend those who cannot defend themselves. The weight of her words settled over the room like a physical presence. You 3, she continued, demonstrated the exact opposite of everything that woman represented. You saw perceived weakness and decided to exploit it. You used your size and numbers to intimidate and threaten. You embodied everything our enemies believe about American soldiers. Rodriguez was staring at the floor. Ma'am, how we make this right? You can't, Sarah replied simply. Some mistakes don't have do-overs. Some choices define who you are permanently. Walsh finally spoke up. Commander, what are you recommending? Sarah turned back to him. Sir, I recommend these 3 be separated from the program immediately. Sexual assault charges should be filed, and they should face court-martial proceedings. Thompson's legs nearly gave out. Commander, please. Our careers, our futures should have been considered before you decided to corner and threaten a fellow service member, Sarah cut him off. Actions have consequences. That's not just military doctrine, it's basic human morality. Wilson tried one more desperate appeal. Ma'am, couldn't we transfer to another unit? Serve our country in some other capacity? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried genuine sadness. You want to serve your country? Then serve it by accepting responsibility for your actions and learning from them. Maybe someday, after you've grown up and figured out what honor actually means, you'll have earned the right to wear a uniform again. But not today, and not in my Navy. Walsh stood, signaling that the conversation was nearing its end. Commander, I'll need your full report by 0600. You'll have it, sir. And these 3... Sarah looked at Thompson, Wilson, and Rodriguez one final time. 3 young men whose arrogance and poor judgment had just cost them everything they thought they wanted. They have a choice to make, sir. They can spend the rest of their lives blaming others for their mistakes, or they can use this as the wake-up call that saves them from becoming the kind of men who destroy lives instead of protecting them. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, heavy, acrid, and impossible to ignore. 3 futures have been decided in a shower facility, not by the actions of their victim, but by choices they had made themselves. Sometimes the most important lessons are the most expensive ones, and sometimes the price of wisdom is everything you thought you wanted. 6 months after the incident that shattered 3 military careers, Sarah Martinez stood in the Pentagon briefing room, presenting her findings to a panel of senior naval special warfare officers. The report she had compiled was comprehensive, damning, and unfortunately necessary. Gentlemen, she began, clicking through slides that detailed systemic issues in the training culture. What happened at Coronado was not an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of a culture that has allowed toxic masculinity to masquerade as warrior ethos. Admiral Robert Chun, head of Naval Special Warfare Command, leaned forward in his chair. Commander, your recommendations? Complete overhaul of the training program, sir. New instructors, revised curriculum, mandatory counseling, and character evaluation for all candidates, and zero tolerance for harassment or assault of any kind. And the 3 cadets involved in the original incident. Sarah's expression remained professionally neutral, separated from service with other than honorable discharges. Court-martial proceedings resulted in conviction for assault and conduct unbecoming. They're currently serving sentences in military prison. Admiral Chin nodded grimly. Has there been any follow-up contact? Yes, sir. 2 of them have requested to speak with me. I've declined the meetings. But that wasn't entirely true. Sarah had received more than just requests for meetings. She had received letters, dozens of them, from all 3 men. Letters that revealed the depth of their fall from grace and, more surprisingly, genuine evidence of reflection and growth. After the briefing, Sarah returned to her temporary office at the Pentagon, where the latest batch of correspondence waited on her desk. Against her better judgment, she had been reading them. The first letters had been predictable, angry, blame-shifting, full of excuses and self-pity. But gradually, over the months, the tone had changed. Thompson's latest letter, written from the brig at Naval Consolidated Stockade, Norfolk, was different from his earlier correspondence. Gone was the angry young man who had blamed everyone but himself. In his place was someone who seemed to be grappling with genuine remorse. Commander Martinez, asterisk, I know you probably won't read this, and I understand why. I've written you 12 letters, and you've responded to none of them. I don't expect that to change. Asterisk, but I need to tell you something, even if you never see these words. You were right. About everything. Asterisk, I've had 6 months to think about that night, about who I was and what I thought I was entitled to. I've talked to counselors, chaplains, other prisoners who made similar mistakes. I've read books about honor, about what it really means to be a warrior. Asterisk, I was never going to be a Navy SEAL. Not because I wasn't physically capable, but because I didn't understand what it meant to protect instead of exploit, to serve instead of dominate. You tried to show me that in your story about Fatima, but I was too proud and angry to listen. Asterisk, I'm listening now. Asterisk, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect another chance. But I wanted you to know that your lesson, as expensive as it was, wasn't wasted. I'm not the same man who cornered you in that shower. I'm trying to become someone worthy of the uniform I lost the right to wear. Asterisk, if I ever get out of here, if I ever get the chance to serve again in any capacity, I'll remember what you taught me about real strength. About protecting those who need protection instead of preying on them. Asterisk, thank you for not killing me that night. You could have, and we both know it. Thank you for showing mercy to someone who didn't deserve it. Asterisk, respectfully. Asterisk, Marcus Thompson. Asterisk, Sarah set the letter down and rubbed her temples. These communications have been arriving for months, and each one made her more uncomfortable than the last. Not because they were threatening or inappropriate, but because they suggested something she hadn't expected, genuine transformation. Her secure phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize. Commander Martinez. Ma'am, this is Captain Rodriguez at the Norfolk brig. I'm calling about one of your former cases. Sarah's attention sharpened. Which one? Marcus Thompson. Ma'am, he's been stabbed. He's in critical condition at Portsmouth Naval Medical Center. The news hit Sarah harder than she expected. Details, Captain. Prison fight. Thompson intervened when 3 inmates were assaulting a smaller prisoner. Took a shiv to the chest, protecting the kid. The doctors say it was touch and go, but he's stable now. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Captain, was this intervention typical behavior for Thompson? Ma'am, that's why I'm calling. Thompson has become something of a protector for the vulnerable inmates here. This is the 3rd time he's intervened in situations like this. He's built a reputation as someone who stands up for people who can't defend themselves. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her office, staring at the stack of letters on her desk. Thompson's words echoed in her mind. I'm trying to become someone worthy of the uniform I lost the right to wear. 2 hours later, she was walking through the corridors of Portsmouth Naval Medical Center, her dress blues drawing respectful nods from medical staff. She had told herself she was coming for closure, to see if Thompson's transformation was genuine or just another manipulation. Thompson was awake when she entered his room, though clearly weak from surgery. When he saw her, his eyes widened in genuine shock. Commander Martinez. How did you... Captain Rodriguez called me, Sarah said simply, taking the chair beside his bed. He tells me you've been playing hero. Thompson tried to sit up straighter, but winced at the movement. Ma'am, I was just doing what anyone should do. No, Sarah corrected. You were doing what a warrior should do. There's a difference. They sat in silence for several minutes before Thompson spoke again. Ma'am, did you read any of my letters? I read all of them. Thompson's surprise was evident. I didn't think you never responded. I didn't know how to respond, Sarah admitted. I spent my career learning to identify enemies and allies, threats and assets. But I never learned how to deal with someone who genuinely transformed themselves. Thompson stared at the ceiling. I'm not transformed, ma'am. I'm just trying to figure out how to live with what I did. How to become someone who deserves to exist in the same world as people like you. Marcus, Sarah said, using his first name for the first time, what you did tonight protecting that prisoner, that took real courage. It wasn't courage, ma'am. It was just right. Those men were picking on someone weaker, and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. Not anymore. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. She found none. The prisoner you protected, tell me about him. Thompson's expression softened slightly. Kid named Jimmy, 19 years old, in for theft. He's small, scared, doesn't belong in a place like this. The other inmates saw weakness and decided to exploit it. He paused, just like I did with you. And what made you decide to intervene? Your story about Fatima, Thompson said without hesitation. You said strength protects weakness, that warriors exist to defend those who cannot defend themselves. I realized I had the chance to be like her instead of like the Taliban fighters who wanted to execute her. Sarah was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Finally, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Marcus, I've been doing some research into your case. Your sentence is scheduled for review in 18 months. Thompson nodded. Yes, ma'am, though I don't expect much to change. That depends, Sarah said, opening the folder, on whether you're serious about redemption. She pulled out several documents and placed them on his bedside table. These are applications for programs that help former military personnel transition into civilian service roles. Emergency services, disaster relief, community outreach. Thompson stared at the papers in disbelief. Ma'am, why would you? Because, Sarah interrupted, I've learned something important over the past 6 months. Real warriors don't just destroy enemies. They rebuild allies. And sometimes, people who have fallen the farthest are capable of climbing the highest. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Marcus, there's something else you should know. Captain Rodriguez told me about your reputation in the break, about how you've been protecting other prisoners. That's not the action of someone trying to manipulate his way out of prison. That's the action of someone who has genuinely learned what honor means. Thompson's voice was thick with emotion. Ma'am, does this mean do I have a chance? To serve again somehow? You're already serving, Sarah replied. Every time you stand up for someone who can't defend themselves, every time you choose protection over exploitation, you're serving the values that matter. The uniform is just fabric. The real uniform is worn in here. She tapped her chest over her heart. Your military career is over, Marcus. That can't be undone. But your service to others doesn't have to be. Use these months to continue becoming the man you want to be. And when you get out, maybe we can find a way for you to earn back the right to protect and serve. As she reached the door, Thompson called out one last time. Mom, thank you for giving me the chance to prove that night wasn't who I really am. Sarah turned back with something that might have been a smile. Don't thank me, son. Thank Fatima. She's the one who taught me that people are worth saving, even when they don't think they deserve it. Especially then, outside in the corridor, Sarah allowed herself a moment of reflection. 6 months ago, she had written off 3 young men as irredeemable failures. Tonight, she had discovered that sometimes the most broken things could be rebuilt into something stronger than they had ever been before. Sometimes justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about redemption, second chances, and the possibility that people could grow beyond their worst moments. But first, they had to prove they deserved those chances. And in a prison medical ward, one former cadet had just taken the most important test of his life and passed. 18 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in a small community center in Denver, Colorado, watching Marcus Thompson address a group of at-risk teenagers. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the arrogant young man who had cornered her in a shower facility, replaced by someone who spoke with quiet authority about choices, consequences, and the difference between strength and power. Real strength, Marcus was telling the teens, isn't about who you can intimidate or dominate. It's about who you can protect and lift up. I learned that lesson the hard way. Sarah had been tracking the progress of all 3 former cadets since their release from prison. Wilson had disappeared into civilian life, apparently content to forget his military aspirations entirely. Rodriguez had moved back to his hometown and was working construction, staying out of trouble, but showing no particular interest in service or redemption. But Thompson had chosen a different path. After his early release for exemplary behavior and his intervention to protect fellow prisoners, he had thrown himself into community service with the same intensity he had once brought to military training. Youth mentorship, disaster relief, volunteer work with veterans organizations. He seemed determined to spend the rest of his life making up for one terrible night of poor judgment. "Miss Sarah?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see a young girl, maybe 16, approaching hesitantly. "Are you the Navy lady Mr. Thompson told us about?" Sarah smiled. "I am Sara Martinez. And yes, I'm in the Navy. He said you saved his life." "Actually," Sarah replied, glancing at Marcus, who was still speaking to the group, "I think he saved his own life. I just gave him the opportunity to do it." The girl, who introduced herself as Maria, sat down next to Sarah. "Mr. Thompson said you're like super tough, that you could beat up anybody." "Being tough isn't about fighting," Sarah said gently. "It's about knowing when to fight, when to show mercy, and when to help others become their best selves." "Is that why you came here today? To see if Mr. Thompson became his best self?" Sarah was impressed by the girl's perceptiveness. "Something like that. But also because I wanted to see the work he's doing, to understand how someone changes so completely." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "My brother was in a gang. Mr. Thompson helped him get out. Said he understood what it was like to make choices you can't take back." As Marcus finished his presentation, the teenagers gathered around him with questions and comments. Sarah watched him interact with them, patient, honest, genuinely caring. There was no trace of the predatory arrogance that had defined him that night at Coronado. After the session ended, Marcus approached Sarah with obvious nervousness. "Commander Martinez, I didn't expect to see you here. I was in the area for a conference," Sarah said, which was partially true. "Captain Rodriguez mentioned you were doing this work. I wanted to see for myself." They walked outside together, the Denver skyline stretching before them in the afternoon light. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am. Do you ever regret how things turn out? The military career you lost, the path you could have taken?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "Ma'am, I regret what I did that night. I regret the person I was. But honestly, I don't regret where it led me. The man I was becoming in the military, arrogant, entitled, looking for people to dominate instead of protect, that man would never have been worthy of the uniform." He gestured back toward the community center. "These kids, they need someone who understands what it's like to make terrible choices and live with the consequences. Someone who can show them that your worst moment doesn't have to define your entire life." "I can do that because I've been there." Sarah nodded. "And what about the future? What are your plans?" "I'm starting nonprofit," Marcus said, his voice gaining enthusiasm. "Focus on at-risk youth, former gang members, people who need a second chance. I want to create the kind of support system I wish I'd had when I was making those bad choices." "That sounds like important work." "It is. And, ma'am, I want you to know, every day, every decision I make, I think about that story you told us. About Fatima. About how courage comes from character, not from size or intimidation. She's my inspiration now." Sarah felt something she hadn't expected, pride. Not in Marcus's transformation, exactly, but in the possibility that even the worst mistakes could lead to meaningful redemption. "Marcus, I have something for you." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a single military patch, not a SEAL trident, but the patch worn by Navy chaplains. "I don't understand," Marcus said, staring at the patch. "It belonged to my father," Sarah explained. "He was a Navy chaplain for 30 years. He always said that the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with compassion, wisdom, and the willingness to help others find their way back from darkness." Marcus's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Ma'am, I can't accept this. I'm not worthy." "You're not a chaplain," Sarah interrupted, "and you may never wear a uniform again. But you're doing the same work my father did, helping people find redemption, showing them that their worst moments don't have to be their final moments." She pressed the box into his hands. "He would have liked what you're doing here. He would have said you're serving in the way that matters most." Marcus stared at the patch for a long moment before carefully closing the box. "Commander, there's something I need to tell you. About that night." Sarah waited. When you first changed, when we realized who you really were, for just a moment, I was angry. Not scared, not ashamed. Angry. Because you had made me look weak, made me feel small. He paused, struggling with the admission. Even in that moment, my first instinct was to blame you for my humiliation instead of taking responsibility for my actions. Why are you telling me this? Because that anger, that refusal to accept responsibility, that was my real problem. The assault, the intimidation, those were just symptoms. Until I dealt with the underlying disease, I was always going to be a danger to people who couldn't fight back. Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine insight there. And now I understand that being humiliated by someone stronger than me was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to confront who I really was, not who I pretended to be. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city bustle around them. Marcus, Sarah said finally, I need to tell you something. When I first recommended your separation from the Navy, I didn't think you could change. I thought you were just another predator in uniform, someone who would always look for victims to exploit. Marcus nodded. You weren't wrong, ma'am. That's exactly who I was. But I was wrong about your potential, about your capacity for growth. And I'm sorry for that. Don't be sorry, Marcus replied. You gave me exactly what I needed, consequences severe enough to force real change. If you had gone easy on me, if you had given me another chance without making me earn it, I would have just found better ways to hide my flaws. A group of teenagers was leaving the community center, several of them waving at Marcus as they passed. One young man, heavily tattooed with gang markings that were clearly in the process of being removed, stopped to talk. Mr. T, my little sister wants to know if you'll speak at her school next week. Of course, Luis. Text me the details. After the young man left, Sarah asked, How many kids are you working with now? About 40 in the regular program, maybe 100 more through various schools and organizations. Marcus smiled. It's not saving the world, but it's something. Marcus, do you know what my kill count is for my deployment years? The question surprised him. No, ma'am. 43 confirmed enemy combatants eliminated in direct action. And I'm proud of that service. Those are people who needed to be stopped. Sarah paused. But if you help even half of these kids avoid the path that would have led them to become enemies of society, your impact on the world will be greater than mine ever was. The weight of her words settled between them. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think people like Wilson and Rodriguez could have found this kind of redemption too, if they had chosen differently? Sarah considered the question carefully. I don't know. Redemption isn't just about wanting to change. It's about being willing to do the hard work of transformation, even when nobody is watching, even when there's no guarantee of forgiveness. She looked at Marcus directly. You chose the hardest path possible. You could have served your time quietly, gotten out, and lived a normal life. Instead, you chose to confront your flaws publicly, to dedicate your life to protecting the kind of people you once preyed upon. That takes a special kind of courage. It's not courage, ma'am. It's just necessary. I can't undo what I did, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure other people don't make the same mistakes. As the sun began to set over Denver, Sarah realized that her journey with Marcus Thompson had come full circle. What had begun as a story of assault and punishment had evolved into something far more complex, a testament to the possibility of redemption and the power of genuine transformation. Marcus, she said, preparing to leave, I want you to know something. When people ask me about my greatest accomplishments in the Navy, I usually talk about successful missions, lives saved in combat, strategic victories. She paused, looking back at the community center where dozens of at-risk youth had just received guidance from someone who truly understood the consequences of poor choices. But I think this, your transformation, the work you're doing, might be the most important victory I've ever been part of. Not because I changed you, but because you prove that people can grow beyond their worst moments. Marcus stood a little straighter, and for just a moment, Sarah caught a glimpse of the soldier he might have become if he had found wisdom before tragedy. Thank you, Commander, for seeing potential I didn't even know I had. Thank you, Marcus, for becoming the man you were always capable of being. The world needs more warriors like you, people who fight for redemption instead of domination. As Sarah drove away from Denver, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes the most important battles were won not in combat zones overseas, but in shower facilities, prison cells, and community centers where broken people learned to rebuild themselves into something stronger. Marcus Thompson would never be a Navy SEAL, but he had become something perhaps more valuable, a guardian of second chances, a warrior against despair, and living proof that even the most damaged people could find their way back to honor. In her mind, she said a silent thank you to Fatima, whose courage in an Afghan firefight had taught her that true strength was about protecting others, not defeating enemies. That lesson, passed down through one terrible night and 18 months of hard-won wisdom, was now protecting dozens of young lives in Denver. Some victories, Sarah realized, took years to achieve and looked nothing like what anyone expected. But they were victories nonetheless.